Welcome everyone to a very special episode of Legends and Lectures. I'm here with the one, the only, Rob Houghton, who is here to tell us all about his new book, new for me because I hadn't heard of it until about a month ago, that the Middle Ages in Games. Two things that I love and that we're going to talk about. So Rob, for those who don't know you, can you please introduce yourself?
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks for having me. So I'm a lecturer in medieval history at the University of Winchester, where I've been working there for got over a decade now, teaching mainly stuff to do with continental Europe, running from the year 400 to around 1300. And that's where a lot of my old research was about. Well, I did my PhD thesis addressing the cities of northern Italy. That's not what I'm here to talk about today because I'm also a massive nerd. Um, and I've been doing a lot of work in the last 7 or 8 years relating to representations of the Middle Ages in various forms of media, but computer games in particular. And that's what the book's all about. So beyond that, what do you need to know? I've done a bit of consultancy work with a few different games companies. I suppose the big ones, Paradox Interactive with Crusader Kings, which was a hell of an experience there. And beyond that, I organise the Middle Ages in Modern Games conference and various other events we have annually. And by all means, take a look us up. We're always open for calls for papers and so forth.
Oh, when is that conference? I might put it in the paper.
Brilliant. We've got a few of these actually. So we're coming up in October this year, will be our asynchronous conference. Basically, it's a text-based conference, completely free to participate, to deliver papers and so forth. We'll ask for a paper around 1,000 words plus images. They just get put up over the course of about 3 days in a week in October, and then we have basically forum to ask questions, respond, and so forth. They'll remain up not quite indefinitely, but we have conference proceedings attached to that and everything. Beyond that, what else are we doing? We're going to the International Medieval Congress in Leeds next year, so that'll be in July 2027, with probably a big old strand there, and another one at the Middle Ages in the Modern World Conference being held in Oxford in June next year. So yeah, it's a growing field. It's absolutely brilliant. What's the point in playing games if you've got no one to play them with?
I do have a paper about more of an art a very long article, long-winded article about the women of Elden Ring. So maybe I will put it in.
Yeah, please, absolutely. That'll be absolutely fantastic. I mean, who's organised it? It's Tess Watterson and Vinicius, yeah, Vinicius Cavallo organising the online event this year, and they'd love to hear anything about Elden Ring, which I'm teased about mercilessly because I just keep dying. But,
There's an easy way to do it. I mean, you just use your summons. You'll be fine. You get your stuff. But as you know, because you play Dark Souls quite a lot. You mention it a lot in your book. You know that death is a mechanic. Whenever I hear people say things like, "Oh, I don't want to play those games because you die a lot," you can. The whole point of that is to use it to your advantage. And I always tell people, if you're ever going to play Dark Souls, the best thing to do when second that you pass the intro, run straight into the cemetery, get the wing spear, and throw yourself right off the cliff. Because the skeletons are going to kick you there anyway. So it doesn't matter because now you have the winged spear, which is one of the best early weapons in the game because you can hold a large shield and you have the spear. So you can block an attack at the same time. It is going to be slow, but it is a very easy way to start very well in that game. And it's the same thing with Elden Ring. You can run through. You go run to Caelid if you want to early on. Sure, you're going to die, but at least you'll get access to better weapons, and that's really the joy of well, there's many joys of those games, but it's that idea of I am purposely running into a hard area. I know I'm going to die, but it doesn't matter. I'll be right back in 5 seconds, and I'll now have better weapons.
well, absolutely. No, I do. I like death as a mechanic, which is a lovely, cheery way of starting starting any program. Um, but no, I've been playing my way through the Outer Wilds just
Hmm.
recently. 'Cause I know it's a fairly senior game at this point, but it's
Oh,
it's
it's a
it's a
great
bit
one.
yeah, it's brilliant. It's a bit of a holiday from medieval and fantasy games, but I love the time loop mechanic within that and the liberty it gives you to just try things because you're not really going to lose that much progress.
Hmm.
A number of times I've flown straight into the sun, run out of air doing ill-advised acrobatic maneuvers on a vacuum, an airless moon, or just been eaten by an anglerfish. It's yeah, it's a learning process, and it's much less frustrating because of that one. Like I get that that's the point of Elden Ring and Dark Souls, but I suppose it also this sort of mechanic, this use of death, particularly when it's that hard not to die. And maybe it's just me, maybe it's just because I'm fairly old and my motor skills aren't quite what they used to be. But this sort of difficulty of facing bosses which can one-shot you, and you have to defeat them to progress. And just having to memorize their attack patterns, having to learn how to defeat them or avoid them.
But they all have weaknesses. I mean,
Yeah,
especially in, or even
exactly.
in Elden Ring, most of the bosses you can completely avoid if you want
Yeah.
to. You just don't, if you don't defeat them, you don't get all their special weapons and armor sets and abilities and things like that.
I
But you can
know.
completely skip most of them.
I know. And to be fair, that bit only frustrates me because and then you lose all the little blurb attached to the items. But no, I suppose it's something that I think's common to a lot of games set in the Middle Ages. It's these sort of hardcore mechanics, these systems where you're going to die a lot. You're probably going to die violently.
Oh yes, I
And
remember cracking open Chivalry for the first time when it came out. And it's a very different type of game, but you die within 5 seconds.
yeah, oh yeah, anything with a stamina bar, I'm just doomed straight away. But
But
I
you
think
could level that up though very easily if you want to. And I always
no.
recommend, especially if you're going to be doing tucks and rolls out of the way. If you're not a parrier, I hate parries because I can't time them well. But if you are somebody who blocks or rolls out of the way, just increase your stamina, get that stamina bar all the way up and you'll be fine.
Oh, it's yeah, you're right. There's a lot of strategies to get around it. I think I think the issue I'm possibly having is, well, combined with not being very good at the games in the first place, is getting the time to level up for everything. All the while being, well, especially on the multiplayer platforms, where I'm invariably getting killed by my 12-year-old nephew or something.
So I don't play online games anymore. Just you know what?
Yeah.
I just want to take my time. Okay. We had touched upon medievalism in games. So one of the things that you open up your book by saying is we need to talk about the Middle Ages in computer games, which would say video games nowadays, because I think we've moved on from computer games, and the computer games really means like PC stuff, but just so video games in general. But what is this medievalism concept? Because in the book you say it's a contested term. So what is medievalism?
Brilliant. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. It is a contested term. It's one that I throw around a lot. For me, medievalism is kind of popular culture, popular media representations of the Middle Ages, or anything that comes from kind of that period. So it's got very little to do with historical accuracy, and the book has got very little to do with historical accuracy. It's not that I don't care about that, it's just it's often a trap. I mean, we've seen all this discourse around the Odyssey recently, and anyway, that's probably a subject for a different episode. Um, so for me, medievalism is how people perceive the Middle Ages, how it's portrayed in popular culture, TV, film, and so forth. And that's, as I say, it's not necessarily got anything to do with what the medieval world was actually like or what academics think about when they think of the medieval world. I suppose a great example of this, which is maybe dated a little bit, is the film A Knight's Tale.
Oh, it's a great film though.
It's a brilliant film, absolutely brilliant. It was notionally based on Chaucer, which I'm immediately at a loss about because I don't know that much British history. Please don't tell my students. Um, but there are elements within that which are clearly not medieval. So the big jousting scene where they're playing Queen's We Will Rock You, and that's completely out of character for the period, but it's very much in character for the sort of feeling you're trying to evoke around what's basically a martial sport.
Hmm.
So it's this sort of popular perception of the Middle Ages. What do we think of when we think of the period? So are we thinking of knights in shining armor? Are we thinking of brutal Vikings? Are we thinking of castles, of dragons, and so forth? And within the book, I've gone for the broadest possible definition of this. Is anything that feels like it's kind of medieval-y, we can throw under this banner of medievalism. So
And
this stretches us back to the end of Rome, up to the start of the early modern world, and it includes all manner of fantasy games.
so you did mention, well, I mean, one of the OGs. You mentioned Rome Total War,
Yeah,
and I thought, ooh, this is pretty early for because this is not the Middle Ages. This is the Iron
yeah.
Age. So I just think it's interesting that even that. Oh, so what about medievalism works so well in video games?
Yeah, that's really good. So I suppose first, yeah, with Rome Total War. I mean, this is stretching things a little bit even for me, but it's the Barbarian Invasion expansion pack, which is basically all about Attila the Hun, about the fall of Rome. So we can stretch that to the start of the Middle Ages, especially as that's conflated with the Dark Ages.
No, I
But
mean, we don't use the D word here. Say or as I usually say to the medievalists who are here, did Rome really fall though? Did it really?
no, you're absolutely right, and this is something to talk about, isn't it? So yeah, the concept of Dark Ages. I mean, this doesn't really comply with most modern scholarly thinking about the Middle Ages. Where we'll talk about the Dark Ages, where everyone stops writing everything, all the glories of Rome are lost, and everyone is really dumb and covered in mud for about 1,000 years, and then the
Nonsense.
Renaissance comes along and everything's glorious sunshine and light all over again. Um, and that's not how it happened. That's not what scholarly consensus is. But it's really hard to get away from that depiction in modern media about the Middle Ages because that's the popular perception of it. Even where it's not the popular perception of it, it's got its roots so deeply in modern media, in popular culture, that it's very hard to get away from it.
We'll talk about myths from the Middle Ages in a second, but there are games that break away from that. Witcher is very colorful,
Oh yeah,
even though
absolutely.
even though there are Kingdom Come is very colorful too, and I think they get certain things right about even though obviously Witcher is a very high fantasy world, it do get some things right about the High Middle Ages that many more quote unquote historical games get wrong. And
Yeah,
so you write in your book, while scholarly literature addresses ludic medievalism as substantial, it represents relatively small subfield within the broader field of historical games. So
yeah.
what do video games get right about the Middle Ages?
You've got to say, so yeah, absolutely right. So yeah, there's been a lot written about history in games. Been a fair amount written about the Middle Ages in games. The fact that my book was the first monograph in English to be devoted to the subject is a little bit telling because we've had books about different periods in history, about history in games in general, coming out for well over a decade now. Um, but what do games get right? That's a good question. It's not one that I normally get too engaged with. Because again, it comes down to historical accuracy. And I'm not too fussed about historical accuracy in games because, well, to be fair, it's a game. I'm not saying it's not serious, but the very nature of the medium means that as soon as you press play, you're going to start diverging from historical accuracy. You're going to start diverging from what happened. So even with something like Crusader Kings, with this huge, really detailed model of the medieval world, as soon as you hit play, you're going to start messing stuff up. You're going to be, I don't know, you're going to be assassinating your idiot son. You're going to be breaking from the church 200 years too early. You're going to be declaring a crusade on Ireland just because you can. So for me, yeah, events I'm not too worried about. I'm not too worried about games getting history right. Because if you want that, you want to go to a textbook, you want to go to a museum exhibition, and you could do that for a game, but why would you want to? We already have books and museums to do that. Where I think games can do really interesting things, though, it's not so much about the what happened or the when it happened. It's about how it happened and why it happened. So getting us to think about through games like Civilization, like Crusader Kings, think about historical forces. Think about, if you want, the rise and fall of empires or interpersonal relationships. Getting us to think a bit more about different historical theories. And in particular, games like The Witcher, these role-playing games, which we get so many of relating to the Middle Ages, they're really good at getting us to get into character,
Hmm.
to start to think a little bit about, well, how did people feel in the Middle Ages? We've got a decent idea about how they acted, but can we think about why they acted in that particular way? And fantasy games, I mean, they've got slight variations on this because, well, if there's literal monsters living in the next valley, then you can be forgiven for believing in monsters. But we get a bit more of an idea of the sorts of societies that exist within these worlds. And so I suppose that's what it is for me, is not so much about getting the facts right, because we've got plenty of other ways of doing that. It's about engaging with the past, engaging with the Middle Ages in different ways, whether that's through mechanics, whether that's through role play.
Yeah, and whenever I hear, I really wish people would I understand, there are certain series that are much more historical than others for sure.
Mm.
So something, let's say like something like Crusader Kings or even Civilization, which bases itself in history. And Civ is great. Civ is great for many things. But when you suddenly hear one of your students going, "I'm trashing Athens," and the other room you go, "Okay." The historic, as you say, the historic accuracy starts to fail. What I always go off about is something, let's say like Assassin's Creed, where they're like, "Yes, this is historically accurate." I go, really? Then why do you have druids?"
It's
In
still, yeah.
900 AD.
No,
So,
I mean, I think, yeah, they were just hiding on Anglesey the whole time.
all the whole
It's,
time. Yeah,
but
I'm
no,
sure.
yeah, and historical accuracy is often a trap. It's something that very quickly gets pedantic if you're lucky. If you're less lucky, it very quickly turns into it's just a tool of enforcing a particular viewpoint about the
Right.
Middle Ages
Mhm.
onto the past. Um, Whether that's, well, the Middle Ages were universally white
Yeah.
or male dominated. It's a way of demanding that games portray the past in a particular way. And of course, we see this with all sorts of media, but it's maybe particularly pronounced within games.
Yeah, and this is my next question was going to be, what are some popular myths about the Middle Ages that games keep getting wrong? And as you said, one of those things is that either all of medieval Europe was white, or if, one of the ones I love is that that Vikings had, eyeliner and tattoos. We don't know that. Or that the Stagas were
Yeah,
historical, or that people didn't wear color. That is something interestingly that, like I said, some video games get right, like in
yeah,
Kingdom Come and Witcher, is that they have the beautiful Landsknechts type of outfits that people wear, which is beautiful. And or that one that really kills me is that samurai didn't have guns. It's like, no,
yeah,
samurai had lots of guns. They've had guns since the 1200s, since the first Mongolian invasion. Of course, so when I look at now, I understand, as I had actually spoke to somebody about this, because when For Honor, which you mentioned in your book, came out by Ubisoft, I said this because it's three different fat warrior factions in history, and I just thought this was hilarious because I go, no, the samurai would win. They had guns. It was that's how they got rid of
yeah.
their masters in Japan, is that they had guns, and then of course they sided with the Portuguese Jesuits, and they gave them more guns.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's for honor's a yeah, for honor's a really good jumping off point for that. So I
But they
suppose it's
do
not
have guns in the game now. They do, yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
but no, it's this whole what's the term for it? Fantasy kitchen sink.
Yeah.
Or maybe not quite fantasy, historical kitchen sinks. You're absolutely right. You've got samurai who, yeah, who don't have guns where they possibly ought to have guns. But at the same time, or possibly ought to have guns, they would have had guns.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they're going up against knights from who could well be contemporaneous, maybe a little bit later, but also Vikings. And so, I mean, forget about who'd win between the samurai and the knights. I mean, the Vikings have, I mean, by all accounts, they've got no chance.
No, they would be dead
Um,
by then.
Apologies to any Scandinavians. It's this sort of idea that the Middle Ages all happened all at once,
Hmm.
which we see showing up in a lot of media, to be fair. But I think possibly in games in particular, because you're right, we see this in For Honor, we see this to some extent in games like The Witcher. Morrowind is another great example. Morrowind, so The Elder Scrolls is another great example of this. We get all these different all these different cultures, all these different groups drawing inspiration from the Middle Ages, yes, but from vastly different points in the Middle Ages. And the Warhammer series in particular is very prominent with this, where what you've got potentially Vikings coming down from the frozen north, worshipping
Space
chaos.
Vikings. Space.
Space Vikings, yeah, Space Vikings, yeah. Um, going up against going up against high medieval knights, going up against steampunk steam tanks, and that's before you even get into the non-human groups. But yeah, so this idea that the Middle Ages happens all together all at once is something that could be yeah is fairly prominent within games. At the same time, the idea of a global Middle Ages often shows up. The Middle Ages works the same for everybody. There's always going to be a Dark Age. Sorry, there's always going to be a Middle Ages after the ancient world, before the modern world. So
Hmm.
things like civilization and so forth. What else do we have? Yeah, I like the stuff about color as well. So it's a relatively minor one, but I think games maybe avoid the use of like these overly black and white and brown palettes when it comes to the Middle Ages. And certainly there are examples where that is all you'll see, aside from the occasional blood splatter. I mean, we're back to Dark Souls, I suppose. But a lot of these games, they use quite vibrant colors, if only to tell you who your allies, who your enemies, which team are these soldiers on. So yeah, most of their kit will be what these greys, these browns, and so forth, but they'll be wearing a bright blue tabard to tell you actually they're your friends.
In Witcher, they use it for like Redania is red and white, and they use it for all the different kingdom factions. Nilfgaard is black, and I think Oxford is a different color set, but they're much better about showing you different colors in The
Yeah,
Witcher. Whereas some the Kingdom Come, I think, is pretty good when it comes
yeah,
to not using that stereotype. I think another thing that some of these games get wrong is that they think that everybody was subject to feudalism, which was absolutely not true.
yeah. I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, certain like action games, role-playing games, very much go straight down that route. Um, with the strategy games, it's maybe a little bit different. So certainly you get things like Crusader Kings, where they've like the entire game is basically built on a feudal pyramid. And because, well, for various reasons, but primarily because they spent all these resources building a game around that pyramid,
Hmm.
that's what society has to look like regardless of where you are. And there's been in a lot of the recent DLC, they've been expanding into China, into the Eurasian steppe, in the Muslim world, creating these different societies, these different political systems. But ultimately, once you dig down into them, they're essentially still the feudal pyramid, because that's the core game mechanic. You can't change that and have a functioning game. At the same time, though, with other strategy games, they just don't bother with feudalism. When being a king in civilization is pretty much exactly the same experience as being a president or a pharaoh.
Yes. Yeah.
It's that, yeah, there's a huge amount of variety, I suppose, is the point there.
I think there's a lot of these misconceptions seem to happen in Western games because if you've ever played something like you don't mention Dynasty Warriors, but if you ever play something like Dynasty Warriors, they're perfectly happy to throw historical accuracy out the window
Yeah.
and just you play as Lubu or it's even something like a Romance of the Three Kingdoms where that is a little bit more historically based. Like you say, they're happy to throw the historical accuracy out the window for the sake of good gameplay. They've no problem showing historical scenarios, but then making like Lubu 25 and really hot. Or making
Yeah.
everybody look, or even something like Onimusha, where Onimusha 3 in specific, where suddenly Nobunaga Oda is a
Yeah.
demon. And you go,
Yeah.
okay, sure,
Yeah.
that this is fine.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. This is the thing. So I suppose this is something I should own up to. So for the book, well, you're absolutely right. I focus primarily on Western games. So there's a few references, but yeah, it's very much about the West. You're absolutely right, though. There's a whole load of different approaches to the Middle Ages on a global scale within games.
That's why
Um,
I think something like From Software, which is a Japanese company,
yeah,
is so
exactly.
fascinating because they before the Demon Souls, they did Kingsfield, which was also very medievally based. And even Capcom did a D&D game, and Capcom obviously does
Yeah,
Dragon's Dogma, which is very heavily medieval themed, even if it's not 100% medieval. And now we have Crimson Desert, which is Pearl Abyss, and they're not Western. So,
no,
but
absolutely.
have you tried Crimson Desert yet?
I've not. This is it's on my pile of games to play when I want to be beaten up repeatedly. Uh,
It's
yeah,
not what you think at all. It's very much an open action adventure game. Has nothing, no
that's
Souls
brilliant.
mechanics, no very little to do with RPG levels. It's very much its own sauce, and I think you'll enjoy it. But
Excellent.
that's also
Okay.
they have all different types of mechanics. So even though you play as a hero, you are getting your band back together because they have not feudalism, but this idea of that you are a peasant from the north and you can make your way not as a king, but you can become sort of like a villain of your own demesne essentially.
Yeah,
And but you have to do that throughout the game. But you start out in what you think is a medieval sort of place where they're all having their own faction wars and things get actively retaken over at all times. So
yeah.
you have to go back and take it back. You need resources. There's a very interesting combination of mechanics. But then as the game progresses, technology progresses. And so then you get into this place that has steam technology. And then you get to a place that is more, that looks more Eastern. And and then if you're in the sky, in the sky, there's all of these, I don't want to give it too much away, but there's all these witches, but the witches have technology or I would say that that's technology that's fueled by magic. It's just all over the shop. But it's very, very cool. And they do
Yeah.
have they start you out thinking it's going to be a medieval game, very colorful, not brown,
Yeah. Oh,
and then they trick you by telling you actually there's technology in the world and et cetera, et cetera.
oh,
Um, one other thing that you mentioned in your book I find very interesting. I find that this whole you mentioned the grotesque and the romantic
yeah.
forms of medievalism. So what are those forms of medievalism that we see?
Well, first of all, thanks for the game suggestion because that sounds like it's doing some really interesting stuff with periodization. But um, talking about grotesque and romantic forms of medievalism. So this is something I've lifted wholesale from literary studies of medievalism. Um, Basically, the grotesque, we're thinking your sort of Game of Thrones, your grim, dark representations of the Middle Ages where everything is awful and everyone is a bastard. Then we at the other end of the spectrum, we've got romantic medievalism. So things like, well, yeah, I suppose classic representations of Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, potentially, yeah, some elements of Lord of the Rings. So this more idealistic view of the Middle Ages. And that very often spills out into games, particularly in the ways in which they represent violence. So, and quite often we see games representing both camps at the same time. So grotesque Middle Ages, grotesque medievalism shows up a lot in, well, we can say in Dark Souls, but
Mhm.
in more or less any role-playing game which allows you to decapitate hundreds of opponents, which leave you blood splattered. Dragon Age is a particular example of this. I still can't get over how completely caked in blood you are after killing maybe 8 rats in that opening quest in your mother's basement, and how completely nonplussed your mum is speaking to you when you're coated in blood. So this sort of grotesque depiction of the Middle Ages, everything is really violent. The violence is endemic, it's casual. No one really cares. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got the more romantic visions of medievalist violence, which show up in games a lot as well. So this tends to be more bloodless violence, or at least violence without consequences. So, yeah, you can go around killing people all day and it will have no impact on society. You probably won't even get, no one will even look at you funny because that's just what people do in the period.
Unless there's something like Crimson Desert actually does have
Yeah,
a guild system, sort of like Red, because you mentioned Red Dead Redemption very
yeah,
briefly, and so you some games do have that idea where
yeah,
if you do something bad, you do go away for it. And it's interesting that you mentioned as well a church don't organize religion
yeah,
in games, and in certain games it is a really big deal. So, for example, in The Witcher. Magic is tied to the as the enemy of the church, and Radovid, who is the king who hates all the sorceresses, decides that the eternal flame is going to be his guiding force, and that he's going to get rid of magic, which is a pretty
yeah.
dumb idea because he thinks that magic, which Nilfgaard uses, is the enemy of him, and so therefore he's going to side with the church, and that's going to be it. But then, what other representations of church and organized religions do we see in medievalist games?
Yeah. I suppose if we stick with that sort of theme around the church with magic and technology, I mean, that's very often a way that the church gets represented. I suppose the short answer is it's complicated, but quite often, yeah, absolutely, quite often we'll have the church condemning mages, condemning witches, that sort of persecution, which is like obviously drawn in from, I suppose, early modernism's representations of witch
Yes,
hunt.
there were no burnings in the Middle Ages of witches. Witchcraft was
Her-
only made illegal in the 1600s. Let's just get that out of the way.
Heretics, on the other hand,
Yes,
yeah,
thank you. Yes,
yeah.
heresy was the crime. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
But so yeah, absolutely. So we get a lot of the church coming down very heavily on magic, often tied in with the church being an industrial faction. So this is something we see in the Thief series of games and in Dishonored in particular, where what with Dishonored you have the Church of the Everyman working very closely with industrialization to dominate the world effectively. And going up against this very medieval, very witchy sort of outsider influenced mad assassin, not mad assassin, very good assassin. So we get a huge variety along those lines, but at the same time, we'll often see the church using magic. So, in particular, anything based on Dungeons and Dragons, you'll have your clerics, your paladins, and so forth, all these warriors, yes, but magic users as well. When it
Yeah.
comes down to, sorry,
Oh, and in D&D, it's true that
yeah,
you don't have to, but your character chooses a patron god. And
yeah,
sometimes the gods are not good. You can be a dark paladin and choose an evil god if you want to in
yeah.
D&D.
I mean, this was something that got really interesting for me because I'm going to show my age horribly here, but going back to like first and second edition Dungeons and Dragons, I mean, if you're a paladin, you were always going to be lawful good.
Hmm.
And there are a whole load of restrictions around that. But yeah, more recent editions certainly can be a paladin of more or less any different, well, any different alignment, more or less any different god. And that's a really interesting development for me. Is just you're becoming this idealized vision of what your god represents,
Hmm.
but at the same time, very often tying back into this, well, the Christian ideal or the Christian model of goodness. So even if you're a lawful evil paladin, you'll probably be stomping around in effectively holy armor. It's going to be probably black, maybe red, maybe chrome. There'll be some sort of vibe going on there rather than white and shining. Um, I suppose with this, I suppose this ties back to the representation of the church and power in medievalist games. Because a lot of the time, you're right, the church is exerting a huge amount of influence, whether that's through control of magic or through more mundane means. Very often, the church is the villain of the piece as well, or at least clergy are the villain of the piece. And we see this in, for example, Assassin's Creed 2. There are numerous churchmen throughout the whole game, which you have to assassinate. Ultimately, you get in a fist fight with Rodrigo Borgia, which was very odd, but strangely satisfying.
Yeah.
Um, and I suppose this is the thing, the church is often pitched as an authority figure, and it's often pitched as an antagonist as a result, because, well, if you're playing an action game, if you're playing a role-playing game, you're probably going to be up against the Dark Empire. And in the Middle Ages, the Empire is going to be influenced, if not ruled, by the church. What's interesting for me is most of the time when you're fighting an evil, or when you're fighting the evils of religion, it's not the church, it's not religion that's the problem, it's individuals.
Hmm.
Whether that's Rodrigo Borgia, whether that's any of the numerous members of the Chantry in Dragon Age who get corrupted by various demons, it's always individuals, it's always a perversion of the true meaning of the church, not the true meaning of Christmas. That's a different thing. So yeah, it's complex. A lot of it depends on the sort of game, the genre that you're playing, and to a substantial extent, I suppose, who the intended audience is. And in most cases, well, religion gets downplayed a lot in games in general because, well, possibly because it's easy to offend people, possibly because there are commercial concerns around it. I mean, there's various games. The Binding of Isaac, in particular, is a particular example of this, which were outright banned in various countries because of their depictions of God. So there are commercial concerns around it.
No,
Uh,
blasphemous is very relig like the
oh God, yeah,
iconography. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, has a
that's
lot
an
of
even
religious
better example.
iconography. Absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean, because obviously that's a sort of a Metroidvania style game, but the their images, their Christian images. But it doesn't only have to be the church in medievalism doesn't only have has to be about Christianity. There are
no,
games, let's say like Shadow of the Colossus, where we actually don't know what religion
yeah,
they practice. But whatever Wanda is doing, whatever ritual he's doing is against whatever church they have. We don't know what it is,
mm,
and they're Aaron or depending on what you want to call the religious people are trying to stop him from doing the thing that may or may not be good or may or may not be bad.
yeah,
And they look very much like clergy, even though they have, masks and things like
yeah,
that. So it doesn't only have to be about Christianity, but oftentimes when you're dealing with, medievalist things, yes, there is, or a Christian adjacent or Catholic adjacent sort of church, like in The Witcher, where you have very much people who uh, model them, well, religious aspects of Catholicism, and then other people who
yeah,
believe either more in magic or a less, or maybe they don't believe in any gods at all. There's always some kind of juxtaposition, even if there's no Christianity in the mix.
yeah. It's a useful shorthand, basically. If you want to say, okay, so we're setting a game in the Middle Ages. How do we make it look the part? Well, we're going to drop in a bunch of monks. Here's a cathedral. We'll have incense burning everywhere constantly for some reason. And oh yeah, you've got to have Gregorian chant. So yeah, it's a useful shorthand, and I suppose you're right. We certainly see influences from other religions, other representations of other faiths in medievalist games. I don't think they're as frequent or as prominent, I suppose. And I suppose that they often come with different signifiers.
Mhm.
So, um, for example, yeah, any representations that clearly draw on Islam, they have their own package of tropes associated with them. They're used to signify the exotic with all the baggage that entails. And there's still, yeah, still occasional uses of obviously Islamic inspired architecture, dress, culture, and so forth to signify, well, here are some other, here's a group of outsiders, and here's why they're evil. And that doesn't come up as often in games as it was doing maybe 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah,
But it's
luckily not.
still,
In a lot of
still an
games, so for
infant, yeah,
example, in Crimson Desert, they're not evil,
no,
and
exactly.
in Witcher, Zerrikanians are not evil. They're the ones with the better sword technology, so you better go find them. But no, luckily that there isn't that much these days of that, which I appreciate. In Lord of the Rings, there was a little bit of that with the Easterlings, but
Yeah,
that's part of the book,
exactly.
unfortunately. So, but usually it's not that bad, and which is good, which I appreciate.
No,
And we're moving toward, I would say, like you use in your book the term definition of historical empathy, and the scale of impact remains debated. So, what is historical empathy, and what would you like to see with medievalist games in the future about
no,
historical empathy?
brilliant. So basically, so historical empathy as a concept, it kind of got its start as a teaching technique. It's a way of getting students to think about the past, about different cultures, to basically often to take on the role of figures within past societies. So to try and understand why people acted the way they did. And that's very often because they've got a very different mindset, a very different society around them. When it comes down to games, this is something that's been used a few times for teaching purposes. It shows up a lot with classroom role play. There have been some games developed around that. So the replaying the past, the reacting the past series of classroom board games basically sells itself on this idea that you're going to play the role of a character from history. And it's a really interesting concept. But anyway, um, we've not seen that discussed that much with regards to computer games, certainly historical computer games. There's been a fair body of research looking at role-playing games in general and how they can change how people think, how they feel by getting people to take on different roles. It can go horribly, horribly wrong, but there's plenty of potential for some really positive outcomes there. And when it comes to historical games, we've not really talked about empathy. Basically, when we've talked about historical games and how engage with history, it comes down to, well, it's Adam Chapman's dichotomy, his spectrum between realist games at one end, games like Assassin's Creed, which tell their stories, sorry, tell their history through their narrative, through their audio visuals, and so forth, down to Civilization at the other end. Conceptual games, basically, games like Civilization, which tell their history through their mechanics. And I get exactly why Adam set this up, why he took this approach. And it's largely because we don't really have any role-playing games with historical settings that aren't set in the Middle Ages. So Adam very much focused on games set in the modern period, primarily the 20th century. And there are no role-playing games. That's not true. There are very few role-playing games. There's very little games which take this more empathetic approach. With the Middle Ages, though, especially if we're including fantasy games, which I really think we ought to, we've got loads of role-playing games. And we've got a very different way of approaching history through them, which doesn't quite fit with this realist idea. Because yes, they have beautiful graphics, and certainly they tell their history through their story, but that's not the only thing they're doing. They're also making you act as a character within this history. So for me, that's where historical empathy or yeah, empathetic games come in. It's this way of engaging with the past in a bit of a different manner. And it's not just restricted to role-playing games. You can role play in any game of your choosing. It's just role-playing games are particularly orientated towards that style of play.
Hmm.
And it's something that's bled out into a lot of games in the realist genres, in the conceptual genres, when they're focusing on the Middle Ages. So again, we've got Crusader Kings is a great example. On paper, it looks very similar to Civilization or any of these big strategy games. It looks like you're just painting the map your color. But when you sit down and play it, it's increasingly about role play. It's increasingly about where you're playing as this character. You might be playing as a king, but you're not playing as the kingdom. And yeah, the kingdom's important, but so's your personal relationships.
Hmm.
So's going on pilgrimage. Whether you believe in God or whether you need to keep your subjects on side. So yeah, it's a bit of a different way of exploring history through games.
You said that it applies to certain modern games, and so I would think something like Disco Elysium is pretty
Yeah,
close, yeah, for
exactly.
sure.
Yeah,
Um,
that's the thing. So that's why I had to correct myself. It's explicitly not the case that it's only the Middle Ages that have role-playing games, but I feel fairly secure in saying the majority live role-playing games live in the Middle Ages. Disco Elysium, absolutely brilliant as
yeah.
well.
Oh, same thing with Cyberpunk 2077,
Yeah,
but it's also not. But again, you can see a lot of the systems that were built for this. Uh, if you look at the tabletop game, a lot of these things wouldn't exist without Dungeons and Dragons. And so Dungeons and Dragons, because it was built on um, medieval uh, fantasy enactments, that's how we get a lot of our modern role-playing games is all based on a subset of homebrews or something very similar to D&D. And then D&D, like I said, came out of fantasy reenactments of Lord of the Rings, and then again, that they just all built on that.
yeah,
People forget that some of the first mini games were Napoleonic War games, and
absolutely.
yeah. Um, and so you
It's
mentioned.
Sorry, I was going to say it's all yeah, it's all interconnected. What's the term? It's transmedial.
Yes.
Yeah, everything influences each other,
Yes,
and I think
exactly.
it's interesting because we're starting to see some video games influencing board games, influencing literature as well. I mean, often very overtly and sometimes not particularly well, but it's yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening.
And even in games that are very, again, have multimedia and multi-mixed technology, something I'd say like Monster Hunter, where you have all different types of Monster Hunter games, but they all share the same world. There are still, I guess, medieval elements to those things that we think of. Yes, they do have some technology, but it's very minor. It's really mostly only in the weapons, and even then, it's just gunpowder, which they did have. In certain places in the Middle Ages, just saying. So, what are your favorite recent medieval games?
That's a joyfully easy question. Esoteric Ebb is my favorite game that's come out this year. But conveniently is also medievalist. So again, this is very much Dungeons and Dragons, but doing a lot of interesting things. So first of all, there is combat in the game, but it's more scripted. It's less free flowing,
Hmm.
which is always a bonus for me. There's also a lot of yeah. First of all, it's funny as all hell as well.
Yes,
It's very
yes.
well written. It does a lot of interesting things with standard fantasy tropes, standard tropes from Dungeons and Dragons, and it's all about a murder mystery. So we talked about Disco Elysium briefly. It's kind of that, only much more upbeat and set in a fantasy world. And throughout all of this, the core plot is you're solving a mystery about why a tea shop blew up. You're a crime-solving cleric. It's a great start with a goblin sidekick, or well, no, a goblin friend. Let's be fair. Um, and throughout that's the core of the plot. There's all manner of interesting things going on around that, but for me, a lot it's just the background. It's the lore within the game because it addresses a bunch of different political theories, a bunch of moral, ethical quandaries, and it it uses the D20 mechanic as a core part of the story.
Hmm.
So it's something that makes sense right the way through. Um, yeah, and I think something that particularly struck me about it as well. So a lot of role-playing games, there are very clear moral choices to be made. This is the right thing to do. This is the wrong thing to do. Typically you'll be rewarded for doing the right thing, whether that's just in narrative terms, like you save the orphanage, brilliant, great stuff, everyone gets a cookie, or whether it's in mechanical terms. You save the orphanage, and I don't know, little orphan Annie over there was secretly carrying this massive chest of gold and this broadsword +5. You don't get that in this game. You don't get much resolution for the actions that you've taken. You'd never get to find out if your choice was right or wrong. And that's, or sorry, if your choice had positive or negative outcomes.
Hmm.
You're just left with making the moral choice based on your knowledge at the time, your inklings of what might or might not happen as a result. And that's got the potential to be really frustrating. But for me, it was a nice change. It, if nothing else, I suspect it's going to save a bunch of players from looking up the golden ending and then trying to walk their character through the precise right series of events, the right series of choices to get the happy ending. Because the ending's ultimately very, this is a major spoiler, I want to say, the ending's ultimately very similar no matter what you do. We're here for the journey, I think, is the thing to take home from this part of the talk.
Yes, so I feel the same way about Pentiment. Pentiment is one of my
Yeah.
favorite games of the last 5 years, and I loved it, but I didn't look up anything. I didn't want to
Mm.
know, and there is no there's endings that are better than, or there I should say outcomes too, because the game is in acts.
Yeah.
But there are certain outcomes to certain acts that are better than others, but it's not an
Oh,
RPG. It's an investigative game. So you don't have to feel it, oh no, it's not like in a Witcher
yeah.
getting the worst ending and you go, ah, I gotta go all the way back to that save and then start over again. But
Yeah.
Pentiment is very much, as you say, is just enjoying the journey and being in the world. I mean, Pentiment's very late medieval, but
Yeah.
it's still
Absolutely.
that enjoying the style, enjoying Andra's story. And I think one game that came out recently that I think is really interesting is Inkulinati. And
Yeah.
I tried that. It's just a manuscript game, and
Yeah.
you make amazing, funny manuscripts. But it's just all about what they give you challenges and what to do, but it's all
Yeah.
about what you can creatively make as somebody who is making a manuscript, which I think is really interesting.
No, absolutely. And Pentiment, I was torn about Pentiment. It's a beautiful game. It's they're doing an interesting thing with it. I just found it very frustrating because about halfway through the first act, I really wanted to look into that shady priest, and there's no way of doing it. It's like, and yeah, I was wrong about what was going on, but I wanted to speak to that shady
Hmm.
priest anyway. But no, absolutely, it's and I like games that take different approaches. So Pentiment, Inculati, all these various different games just doing interesting things. I suppose another example of that, what did I enjoy? It's a while back, but it's Mountain Blade,
Oh yeah, that's good.
which
Bannerlord, yeah, for sure.
absolutely we started. It was basically it's a medievalist combat simulator, but they grew the game. It became more about managing your war band on some sort of campaign map, ultimately being able to gain territory, ultimately becoming a king and potentially conquering the whole of Caldera, the whole of the kingdom. Um, but yeah, it ultimately ended up looking fairly similar to Civilization or to any of these big strategy games. But because of the way it was built, because it was first and foremost a first-person combat game or a third-person combat game, depending on
Hmm.
how it's yeah, um, that stuck with it right the way through to being a king. So if you want to get anything done, you have to speak to someone and make them do it. You can send your marshal off to go and fight a battle on your behalf to go and lay siege to the neighboring town, but you've got to trust that he's going to do the job.
Hmm.
Either that, or you've got to stomp all over the map fighting everything yourself. But it's just, yeah, interesting ways of doing established things.
It's interesting because in Crimson Desert, they give you a choice. You can either send people out to go do those things and to go retake areas that have been taken over by bad men,
Hmm.
or you can do it yourself. And or you can join them. You can send them out and then go to that position, and you will see them doing the thing that you have asked them to do, whether
Yeah,
it's build a bridge or whether it's to fight off bad guys, and you can join them if you want to. And I think the real-time aspects of Crimson Desert are really what make it stand out from anything else that I've seen. It's very interesting the way that all those mechanic works, and very different from Black Desert, which was the
Yeah,
previous game.
yeah,
This is much more realistic and much more, again, in that medieval space. It's very, very cool.
brilliant. Oh, I mean, you told me several points ago, but this is yeah. I'll have to play this for research.
Oh, absolutely. You do need to play because I think as well Crimson Desert was marketed as more of like a Breath of the Wild style game or
Yeah,
like a Zelda-like game. And then once you get into the meat and potatoes of it, you realize, oh no, this is a third-person action game mixed with strategy elements,
yeah,
mixed together with RPG quests, but yet there's no levels. It's very interesting the way that they mix all of these different genres together and make it its own soup. And yet, and there's also base building elements as well. So
yeah.
it's completely its own thing, which I think is very interesting. And it's just never ending. It never ends. I'm like 400 hours in, and I'm only halfway through the
Oh
game.
God.
It's really interesting, and I do even for research purposes, just to see
Oh,
of how many mechanics can you fit in a game. I would say you should try this one, but certainly for the medievalist aspects of it. What do you hope that medieval games do in the future?
what do I have? Right, so a couple of things really. So first of all, yeah, more variety. I mean, there's loads of variety already, but more variety is always good. Whether it's combining different mechanics, whether it's taking an entirely new approach, like creating a new genre is always, oh, sorry, playing a new genre is always fun. Or whether it's bringing in perspectives from outside the West. So yeah, we've touched on well, East Asia's got a thriving gaming community, a lot of which ties into medievalist works, fantasy works, and so forth. I've barely touched on them in the book because you could construct an entire book just looking at Japanese games in the Middle Ages. You could do a multi-volume set. But yeah, there's plenty from China, Thailand. Oh, even India, India's got a burgeoning scene there as well. So yeah, yeah, greater variety of great games, greater variety of points of origin. So that includes Eastern Europe, everywhere, more globally. Show me more games. Um, the other thing that I want to see are smaller games. So partly this is very selfish. For the book, I played over 200 games. That was a lot of time, particularly for some of these big titles, things like The Witcher, where you'll spend hundreds of hours on a playthrough. Things like Crusader Kings, where you can clock up thousands of hours and still be going back to it. I'm interested in these shorter games. So partly because it fits my timescale better, but also because it allows you to do more interesting things, I think. If you've got a game that's only about an hour long but has a whole bunch of different decisions within it, a whole bunch of different outcomes, I mean, I'm pretty likely to play through that a few times. I'm not going to sit down and take another run at The Witcher to see all the different outcomes, to see what happens if I make this one decision back in the first game. I know it's not as bad as Mass Effect or anything like that, but yeah. But shorter games partly so I can get through them faster, partly because it's a different experience. It allows more replayability. And if I'm going to give a very specific final thing that I'd like, more games set in Italy, northern Italy ideally, in say around the year 1000 to around the year 1200. So kind of starting point of the city communes, teetering into city states. Maybe just a lovely game about being a traveling merchant or some sort of artisan. Something about maybe drawing up legal codes in 11th century Italy and having to play the Pope off against the Emperor, all this sort of thing. So yeah, that's what I'd like to see.
Fantastic. There is a smaller game that just came out called Legends of the Round Table. It's all about lesser known myths about King Arthur, but it is a shorter game. It's a strategy game, so
Yeah,
maybe that would be good for you to play. But I like your idea about being a merchant in Italy, and there is a whole class now of merchant RPGs. So something like Moonlighter, where you make your main idea is to make and sell items, but then at night you go out and sometimes you fight monsters or you have to go and find ingredients and then you bring them back. And then you during the day you keep your shop up and meet different people. Potionomics, that was one that came out a couple of years ago where it's very high fantasy, it's not medieval, but you run a potion shop and you have to find items and you have to give them to the right people, etc. So not exactly what you want, but if you could make that with an Italian skin, that that would be great.
To be fair, but that sounds marvelous as is. But yeah, that's brilliant.
Rob, what do you have coming next? What's your next publication?
So what's coming up? I've been editing the Routledge Handbook of Computer Games and History with Kate Cook and Chris Kempshall. So she's Kate is very much the classicist equivalent of me. She's done a whole bunch of really elegant work on the ancient world, but also a whole load of work on Greece, Rome, pretty much the entire pre-medieval world in games of one form or another. Chris Kempshall was until recently he was the foremost, well, no, he's still the foremost name in First World War history in computer games and various other things. As of fairly recently, he's been doing a lot of work with Star Wars, which is a brilliant career transition. But that's coming out towards the end of this year. We've got over 50 authors. I think we're sat on 45 chapters. It's an absolute monster of a volume. Um, I suspect it might be, though it's not geared towards academic audiences, but perhaps wait for the paperback if you're looking for anything from that. Aside from that, now the Middle Ages in modern games is always trundling along merrily. So please do send in, or please do check out our website, middleagesmoderngames.com. And please do send us any responses to the calls for papers for any of the multiple events we're off to do. Other than that, my next big research project, I'm going back to strategy games because I'm still a massive nerd. And basically, I'm writing a book, basically, looking at how strategy games represent the Middle Ages and how we can use that for teaching purposes. And the kicking off point for all of that is there's been a load of stuff written about Sydney as civilization. A lot of it's really interesting, a lot of it's really good. But that's very much not the only game in town
Hmm.
anymore. There's plenty of strategy games, often on a similar scale, which take interesting, different approaches to history and to the Middle Ages in particular. And I want to talk about a whole range of games, whether from millennia and humankind on that sort of big scale, down through the various medieval total wars. Warhammer Total War will probably get a look in there as
Hmm.
well, and of course Crusader Kings. So yeah, that's pretty much me for the next 3 years, I think.
Great. Well, hopefully we'll have you back when you're done with it. I'd love to hear about that one.
Thanks, Michelle.